I woke up that morning with a strange heaviness in my chest, the kind that doesn't come from illness or age, but from something quietly breaking inside you. The house was too still, no rushing footsteps, no half-finished conversations drifting down the hallway, no reason to hurry. I lay there listening to the clock tick, realizing I couldn't remember the last time one of my children had called just to ask how I was doing. Not because they needed something, not because it was a holiday, just to ask. I told myself not to dwell on it. Children grow up, lives get busy, that's what everyone says. Still, as I pushed myself out of bed and made my way into the kitchen, the silence followed me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I brewed my coffee the same way I always had, measuring the grounds by habit, not taste. I set one mug on the counter, even though I lived alone now. Old routines die hard. As the coffee dripped, I glanced at the fridge, still covered in photos from years ago. Birthday parties, graduation smiles, family dinners where everyone leaned in close, laughing over each other. I stood there longer than I meant to, tracing familiar faces with my eyes, wondering how something that once felt so solid could fade without making a sound. I hadn't argued with my children. We hadn't had a dramatic falling out. There was no single moment I could point to and say, "This is where it all went wrong." That almost made it worse. Later that day, I decided to call my daughter. I told myself I wouldn't sound needy. I'd keep it light, just a quick check-in. Her phone rang longer than I expected before going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I didn't want to seem like I was chasing her. I waited a while, then called my son. Same result. I sat there staring at my phone, feeling foolish for expecting anything different. It wasn't anger I felt then. It was something softer and sharper at the same time. A realization forming slowly, like dawn through thick clouds. They hadn't stopped loving me, I told myself. They'd just stopped thinking of me. In the afternoon, I drove to the grocery store. It was the same one I'd gone to for decades, but it felt unfamiliar now. I watched other people move through the aisles, couples arguing gently over brands, parents negotiating with tired children. I wondered if anyone could tell, just by looking at me, that I was someone's mother who no longer felt needed. At the checkout, the young cashier asked if I wanted help taking my bags to the car. I almost laughed at the irony. A stranger offering help so easily, while my own children hadn't asked in months if I needed anything at all. I thanked her and said I was fine. That evening, I cooked dinner for one. I used to make meals big enough to feed an army, always afraid someone would leave the table hungry. Now I stared at a single plate, portions shrinking along with the noise in the house. As I ate, my phone buzzed. My heart jumped before I even looked. It was a group message from my children, a photo of them all together at a restaurant, a birthday celebration for my son-in-law. The caption read, "Great night with the family." I stared at the screen, my fork hovering mid-air. Family. I hadn't even known they were getting together. No one had thought to ask if I wanted to come. That was the moment it settled in fully, not with drama or tears, but with a quiet certainty that made my chest ache. They had built lives that no longer included me in the way I once belonged. I wasn't central anymore. I was optional, an afterthought. I put my phone face down on the table and finished my meal, though I couldn't tell you what it tasted like. Memories kept rising up instead. Late nights helping with homework, early mornings packing lunches, the endless worry, the sacrifices I never counted because that's what mothers do. I hadn't expected repayment. I just hadn't expected this kind of distance. When I went to bed that night, I didn't cry. I lay there thinking, replaying small moments I'd brushed off before. The cancelled visits, the unanswered messages, the way conversations had shifted to polite updates instead of shared lives. It all made sense now. This wasn't a phase, it was a change, and whether I liked it or not, I had to face it. The day I realized my children had moved on without me wasn't loud or cruel. It was quiet, ordinary, and deeply personal, and it marked the beginning of something I didn't yet understand, but knew would change me forever. The days after that realization stretched longer than they should have. Time has a way of slowing down when you're left alone with your thoughts. I went through my routines on autopilot, folding laundry that didn't need folding, wiping counters already clean, turning the television on, just to hear another voice in the room. Friends would ask how my kids were doing, and I'd smile and say, "They're busy," as if that explained everything, as if busyness was a season and not a wall. I told myself not to be dramatic. People my age complain too much, I thought. I didn't want to become one of those parents who guilt their children for growing up. I had raised them to be independent. I had wanted this, hadn't I? One afternoon, I decided to sort through old boxes in the hall closet. I don't know why I chose that day. Maybe I needed proof that the life I remembered had actually happened. Inside were school projects, faded drawings, Mother's Day cards written in uneven handwriting. I sat on the floor and opened one at random. It said, "Thank you for always being there." I laughed softly, not out of bitterness but disbelief. I wondered when always had turned into sometimes, and when sometimes had quietly become almost never. No one announces those changes. They just arrive one day and expect you to adjust. That weekend, my neighbor invited me over for coffee. She'd noticed my lights were always on late and asked if I was sleeping all right. We talked about nothing important at first, weather and aches and the price of groceries. Eventually, she mentioned her daughter, how they talked every day, even if only for a few minutes. I nodded and listened, feeling something tighten in my chest. I wanted to be happy for her, and I was, but it also made me feel like I'd failed some invisible test. When she asked about my kids, I repeated the same line. "They're busy." She didn't push, and I was grateful for that. Later that night, I scrolled through social media, something I rarely did anymore. There were photos of my children's lives, moments I hadn't been part of, new restaurants, weekend trips, smiling faces leaning into each other. I studied the pictures, searching for any sign that they missed me. That was the hardest part to admit. Not that they were happy without me, but that they didn't seem to notice my absence at all. I closed the app and set my phone down, realizing it had become a window into a world I no longer inhabited. I started thinking about how often I had rearranged my own life around theirs, how I'd postponed plans, ignored my own needs, told myself there would be time later. Later had arrived quietly, and it was empty. This wasn't their fault, I knew that. They hadn't asked me to center my world around them forever. Still, knowing that didn't make the loneliness easier to sit with. I wondered who I was now, outside of being their mother. It felt like a question I should have answered years ago. One evening I drafted a message in my phone, just a simple invitation, dinner at my place, no pressure. I stared at it for a long time before deleting it. I didn't want to beg for space in their lives. I wanted to be chosen, not accommodated. That distinction mattered more than I could explain. Instead, I turned my attention inward, something I wasn't used to doing. I asked myself what I needed, not as a mother, but as a person. The answer didn't come right away. As the weeks passed, the ache dulled slightly, making room for something else. Acceptance, maybe, or clarity. I began to see that my children moving on didn't have to mean I was left behind forever. It just meant the shape of my life was changing, whether I was ready or not. I didn't know yet what I would build in the space they'd left, but I knew pretending the space wasn't there would only make it hurt more. And so, quietly, I began to let myself imagine a future that didn't revolve around waiting for my phone to ring. The first step toward reclaiming my life was small, almost imperceptible. I started with routines I had neglected for myself, things that had nothing to do with being a parent or fulfilling anyone else's expectations. I went for morning walks again, breathing in the crisp air that carried the scent of pine and damp earth. The rhythm of my steps felt like a heartbeat reconnecting with my own body rather than moving in time with someone else's schedule. I noticed how the sun filtered through the trees, how the birds sang even when no one was listening. It was grounding in a way I hadn't realized I needed. I also started reading again. Not parenting books, not memoirs about children, but novels I had abandoned in my youth. I read about people who struggled, failed, and yet somehow moved forward. The words weren't just entertainment. They were proof that life could continue, that reinvention was possible. I stayed up late, finishing chapters I had promised myself I would read someday. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty about prioritizing myself. Cooking became another act of reclamation. I tried recipes I'd always admired but never attempted, flavors I'd wanted to experiment with but shelved because I was too busy feeding others. The kitchen became a place of creation instead of obligation. I chopped vegetables with a precision I hadn't used in decades, sprinkled spices in ways that felt reckless and joyous, and plated meals that I ate alone but with pride. I noticed that when I did this, my thoughts about my children didn't vanish, but they no longer weighed me down in the same way. One evening, I decided to tackle the attic, a place I had avoided because it held both memories and guilt. The dust was thick, and the boxes were stacked precariously. I pulled one down and opened it carefully, revealing school yearbooks, photographs, and letters tied with ribbons. I ran my fingers over the edges of the paper, feeling the texture of the past in a tangible way. I smiled at old photos, laughing quietly at hairstyles I thought were terrible, but somehow still charming. The letters were more complicated. Many of them were thank you notes, birthday cards, or scribbled messages saying, "I love you, Mum." I held them close to my chest and felt both grief and gratitude at once. I realized that the bond I had built with my children was not erased. It had evolved, changed shape, but it was still a part of me. Then came the letter I hadn't expected to write to myself, one of those exercises I'd read about but never taken seriously. I wrote about the pain of realizing they had moved on, about the loneliness that followed, and about the small victories I was discovering in my daily routines. I didn't write it to shame them, and I didn't write it as a complaint. I wrote it to validate my feelings, to acknowledge that even though my role as a central figure in their lives had shifted, I still mattered. This exercise was more than catharsis. It was a declaration. I was still here. I was still alive. I was still worthy of joy and connection. After that, I sought out community. I joined a book club at the local library and began attending weekly gatherings. The women I met were of similar age, some widowed, some divorced, some simply seeking a friend. We shared stories that were sometimes funny, sometimes heartbreaking, and sometimes mundane in ways that made them comforting. For the first time in a long while, I felt part of something other than the family unit I had spent decades centering my life around. I listened as others recounted their struggles, and I shared mine carefully, gauging the room until I felt understood. These connections were small, but they were solid. One particularly rainy afternoon, I met a woman named Lillian who would become an unexpected guide. She had lost her children to distance and divorce, and had rebuilt her life in ways I hadn't imagined possible. She encouraged me to take trips, even short ones, by myself. "You've been living on borrowed time, Mom," she said, and I laughed, recognizing that she was right. It wasn't a reprimand, it was a lifeline. I booked a weekend at a lakeside cabin, something I would never have done when my children were younger. Driving there, windows down despite the drizzle, I felt an exhilaration I hadn't experienced since my 20s. I wasn't running from loneliness, I was embracing freedom. When I returned, the changes I was making had a subtle impact on my children. They called less, but when they did, the tone was different. They sensed that I had shifted. The conversations no longer carried the undercurrent of guilt or obligation. Instead, there was a calmness, a boundary I had set that felt both protective and powerful. I was still their mother, but no longer the woman who silently adjusted her life to fit theirs. They didn't yet understand what had changed, but that was fine. The transformation was for me, not them. At home, I began redecorating rooms that had sat untouched for years. I painted the walls in colors I liked rather than neutral tones I had chosen to appeal to their tastes. I rearranged furniture to suit my own needs, hung artwork that inspired me, and filled the shelves with books I actually wanted to read. Walking through my house felt different. It was mine in a way it hadn't been for decades. I discovered pleasure in these small victories, and each adjustment became a metaphor for my larger journey. Slowly, I also allowed myself to reach out to estranged friends and family members I had lost touch with. Some conversations were awkward, some tearful, some full of laughter. But they reminded me that relationships can exist outside the framework of parent and child. Connection doesn't only come from familial bonds. I felt a sense of restoration, as though I were reclaiming pieces of myself that had been buried under decades of caregiving. Through all of this, I noticed that my own perception of time changed. Days no longer stretched endlessly with the weight of absence. They became opportunities for discovery. I learned to appreciate quiet mornings with coffee in hand, the simple act of tending to a plant or writing in my journal without expecting anyone else to read it. I began to understand that being alone didn't have to mean being lonely. In fact, it could be the opposite. As months passed, I found myself laughing more, even at small things. A joke on the radio, a memory triggered by an old photograph, the antics of a neighbor's dog in the yard. These moments became reminders that life continues, that joy can coexist with sadness, and that my role as a mother did not define the totality of my existence. I started to imagine new hobbies, perhaps volunteering, maybe taking a class in something I had always dreamed of, like painting or pottery. Each idea sparked excitement instead of hesitation, and in the quiet moments, when the house was still and the memories weighed heaviest, I realized something profound. My children's independence did not diminish my value. Their happiness without me was not a reflection of my failure. It was a reflection of the foundation I had given them. It was proof that my efforts mattered, even if they didn't acknowledge them the way I had hoped. I could let go of guilt and still hold on to pride. I began noticing the small signs that life was shifting in ways I hadn't anticipated. One morning, while sipping tea on the porch, I realized that the street, once quiet and empty, was humming with life again. Neighbors were walking dogs, children rode bikes, and the air carried a faint mix of fresh-cut grass and car tires on asphalt. It was ordinary, mundane, and yet it felt revolutionary to me. My world, once defined by absence, had slowly started filling up with presence. Not the presence of my children, but my presence in the world around me. I felt rooted again, like a tree after a long winter, finally soaking in sunlight. The phone calls became a different rhythm. My children called, yes, but without expectation or demand. Their voices carried a hint of respect I hadn't heard in years, a recognition that their mother was no longer the one to bend under every whim or crisis. Jason, in particular, had changed in tone. He spoke carefully, almost cautiously, as if testing waters he had previously assumed were his to navigate freely. Danielle's texts, once frantic and subtly demanding, had slowed to polite inquiries. The dynamics were subtle but unmistakable. I was no longer living in the shadow of their lives. With this newfound freedom came a reckoning with memory. I would revisit moments from the past, not with bitterness, but with clarity. I recalled holidays spent cooking enormous feasts while keeping tempers in check, birthday parties meticulously organized while my own needs were shelved, the sleepless nights with sick children while managing my own exhaustion. I felt the weight of it all, but I also recognized the endurance, the love, the strategy behind survival. Each recollection was both a wound and a badge of honor. I started journaling more deeply, moving beyond the daily recounting of events to reflections on how I had survived, adapted, and evolved. My writing became a dialogue with myself rather than a record for anyone else. I pondered why my children had moved on the way they did, why boundaries had been crossed, and how I could maintain love without self-erasure. In these pages, I found answers I had long avoided. I wrote about disappointment, yes, but also about hope, resilience, and the quiet power of patience. Each word was an affirmation of my autonomy. One afternoon, while reorganizing my bookshelves, I discovered a stack of letters Jason had sent me during college. Letters I had never fully appreciated. Reading them now, I noticed his insecurities, his uncertainty, and his longing for approval. It wasn't resentment I felt, it was understanding. I realized that children grow into their own beings, shaped by our guidance, but ultimately making decisions that reflect their own struggles. Accepting this didn't lessen the hurt, but it shifted my perspective from anger to comprehension. It was a subtle yet crucial transformation. I also started reconnecting with long-lost friends. There was Eleanor, whose laughter could still light up a room, and Roger, whose wisdom and calm had always been a counterbalance to my own intensity. We began meeting weekly, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for walks in the park, other times simply to sit in silence and enjoy each other's company. These connections reminded me that relationships don't have to be transactional or fraught with unspoken expectations. They could simply exist. The joy of voluntary companionship was unfamiliar, yet deeply satisfying. Home projects became a metaphor for reclaiming my life. I painted the kitchen a vibrant yellow, the living room a calming teal. I planted flowers along the porch and started a small vegetable garden in the backyard. Each decision was mine alone, and each choice brought a subtle thrill. I noticed the way the sunlight hit the new colors, how the roses I planted last spring were finally beginning to bloom. Every petal felt like a small declaration. I existed, I mattered, and this was my world to nurture. As I embraced these routines, the pattern of my children's involvement shifted further. Tyler, my grandson, began spending more time with me voluntarily. We baked together, planted seeds, and shared stories long into the evenings. His presence was gentle, healing, and joyful. Jason and Danielle, though still physically present in the neighborhood, were gradually receding from my daily focus. Their interference, which had once dominated my emotional landscape, was now peripheral. I realized that controlling the narrative of my own life required focus and deliberate disengagement from the chaos they had created. I also confronted old wounds that had been festering for years. Memories of arguments, of moments when I had been dismissed or overlooked, surfaced unexpectedly. Instead of suppressing them, I faced them directly, speaking aloud to the empty rooms, acknowledging the pain without letting it define me. This practice was not about revenge, nor about cultivating resentment. It was about reclaiming emotional sovereignty, an assertion that my feelings were valid, my experiences real, and my life worth living fully. One day, while walking through a local park, I met a woman named Judith who was leading a workshop for seniors interested in starting small businesses and creative projects. Her energy was infectious, and I found myself drawn to her message. The past does not dictate your future unless you allow it to. Encouraged, I began sketching out ideas for a small business venture that blended my love of cooking, gardening, and storytelling. I imagined workshops, community dinners, and small publishing projects for people like me, those whose lives had been defined by caregiving and who were now ready to cultivate their own dreams. The sense of possibility was exhilarating. Concurrently, I began documenting my journey in more public ways. I wrote articles for local newsletters and online platforms, sharing my story of rediscovery, resilience, and self-empowerment. My voice resonated with an audience I hadn't anticipated, mostly women in their late 50s and 60s, many of whom felt unseen, unheard, and unappreciated. Messages poured in from strangers, thanking me for validating their own experiences. For the first time, my life's work, raising children, enduring hardships, holding love through adversity, was acknowledged in a broader, meaningful context. These interactions also revealed the power of contrast framing. I realized that by openly discussing the hardships, betrayals, and disappointments I had faced, I could juxtapose them with the triumphs, small victories, and renewed sense of autonomy I was cultivating. This contrast created a narrative arc that was relatable and inspiring. Readers and listeners didn't just see a mother abandoned by her children, they witnessed a woman reclaiming her identity, her home, and her voice in ways that felt attainable yet aspirational. I began inviting Tyler into this process, sharing with him the lessons of resilience and personal agency. I taught him how to garden, how to prepare meals, and how to document memories in a way that honored both joy and hardship. Our relationship deepened not because I imposed it, but because he chose it, drawn by the authenticity of my presence. He learned firsthand that love and respect are earned, not assumed, and that boundaries are not punishments, but protections. As the seasons changed, I noticed subtle shifts in the neighborhood. Where once Jason and Danielle's presence had been a source of tension, it now became a faint background hum. Their attempts at dominance or provocation lost their impact. I maintained polite distance while strengthening my own routines, my social connections, and my creative outlets. It was a form of quiet power, a demonstration that life could flourish without needing to confront every slight or injustice directly. I also dedicated time to reflecting on my spiritual and emotional growth. Meditation, prayer, and mindfulness became part of my daily regimen. I found that acknowledging my own worth, independent of others' approval, strengthened my capacity for patience, forgiveness, and joy. This inner work wasn't instantaneous, but the cumulative effect was profound. I felt lighter, freer, and more attuned to my own needs. By the time the holidays arrived, I was not the same person who had experienced the initial shock of abandonment. I decorated my home with intention, inviting friends and community members for a small gathering. The atmosphere was warm, inclusive, and celebratory. My children were not present, and I no longer felt the need for them to be. Instead, I reveled in the relationships I had nurtured, the life I had rebuilt, and the person I had become. This was a different kind of fulfillment, one that arose from autonomy, creativity, and self-respect rather than external validation. I woke the next morning to a quiet house, the sunlight streaming through the lace curtains, dust motes dancing in the beams. It was the kind of morning that held promise without pressure, a luxury I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Tyler was already at the kitchen table, sketching something in his notebook, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration. I poured myself a cup of coffee and joined him, silently observing the boy who had become my anchor, my connection to the family I could no longer rely on in traditional ways. His presence was steady, grounding, and reminded me of what mattered most: the life I could nurture here and now. The sense of control over my own schedule was intoxicating. I could decide how to spend my hours without hesitation, without interference. I began incorporating routines that balanced productivity and creativity. Mornings were for journaling, sketching, and planning small projects, like a new garden bed, or a recipe I had been curious about for years. Afternoons were for community involvement, whether volunteering at the local senior center, attending workshops, or helping neighbors with small tasks. Evenings were reserved for Tyler and quiet reflection. Each segment of the day felt intentional, a testament to the autonomy I had fought so hard to reclaim. I noticed the subtle psychological shift that came from being recognized for competence rather than need. Where once I had been dismissed as old or incapable, now I was sought out for advice, expertise, and assistance. A neighbor asked me to help plan a community garden. A local bakery invited me to speak about small-scale catering and meal prep. Invitations arrived for book clubs, art classes, and charity events. These requests were not obligations, they were acknowledgements of my knowledge and my vitality. I felt seen in ways that transcended familial expectations. Even as my social world expanded, I maintained boundaries. Jason and Danielle, though still physically nearby, remained on the periphery. They occasionally waved or spoke through the fence, but I resisted the urge to engage beyond what felt polite and necessary. I realized that power was often less about confrontation and more about maintaining one's peace. I could exist in proximity to them without allowing their choices to dominate my emotional or physical space. It was a lesson I had learned painfully but now wielded purposefully. Tyler thrived in this environment of respect and stability. I encouraged his interests, helped him explore hobbies, and supported his academic growth. I taught him to value honesty, diligence, and kindness, emphasizing that respect is earned through consistent action. Watching him develop into a thoughtful, capable young man was a reward far greater than any material victory. It reminded me that true legacy is not built through control or manipulation, but through the cultivation of others in ways that honor both autonomy and care. I also dedicated time to personal creative pursuits. Painting became more than a pastime. It became a channel for processing complex emotions. I captured landscapes from memory, abstract interpretations of emotional landscapes, and portraits of people I loved. Each brushstroke was both cathartic and affirming, a declaration that I was alive, present, and capable of creating beauty. My art began to attract attention at local galleries and social media platforms, further reinforcing the idea that fulfillment could be derived independently of familial validation. Community engagement deepened my sense of purpose. I volunteered for a senior advocacy group, teaching workshops on financial literacy, legal rights, and elder independence. Sharing my experiences, both triumphs and hardships, empowered others to take control of their circumstances. Women and men who had felt invisible or powerless began to recognize their own agency. Their gratitude was quiet but profound, echoing in ways that reminded me why I had fought so hard for my own dignity. The contrast between my life now and the days when Jason and Danielle had overstepped boundaries was stark. Then I had felt trapped, anxious, and powerless. Now I moved through the world with intention, clarity, and calm. I understood that my power didn't lie in revenge or dominance, but in the simple, steadfast maintenance of my independence. The house I had bought, the routines I had cultivated, and the boundaries I had enforced were not symbols of spite. They were evidence of a life reclaimed. One day, while watering the rose bushes along the fence, I noticed Jason standing at the edge of his yard, glancing toward mine. There was no malice in his gaze, only a quiet recognition that he could not control the narrative I had rewritten. He nodded slightly and walked back inside, leaving the curtains drawn. The power of presence, I realized, was often subtler than confrontation. It required patience, consistency, and the refusal to react impulsively. Tyler and I continued to build rituals that strengthened our bond. We cooked together every weekend, experimenting with recipes old and new. We shared music, books, and stories, creating an intergenerational dialogue that celebrated curiosity, empathy, and resilience. These moments were a reclamation of family, but on terms that honored both my autonomy and Tyler's growth. I realized that relationships could be rebuilt without dependence on past dynamics of guilt or expectation. I also confronted my lingering feelings of betrayal and abandonment in constructive ways. Through therapy and personal reflection, I explored the emotions associated with being misjudged, ignored, or displaced. I reframed these experiences not as permanent scars, but as catalysts for growth, self-awareness, and empowerment. This process was neither linear nor easy, but each step reinforced the truth that one could emerge from trauma stronger, wiser, and more capable of shaping their own life. Opportunities for connection and influence expanded beyond my immediate family and neighborhood. I began speaking at regional conferences on elder justice, sharing practical strategies for protecting legal rights, establishing boundaries, and cultivating self-respect. My story, once a private testament to survival, became a beacon for others navigating similar challenges. Audience members, often facing neglect, exploitation, or marginalization, expressed relief, inspiration, and determination after hearing me speak. The impact of reclaiming one's narrative, I discovered, extended far beyond personal satisfaction. The seasons changed, bringing both literal and symbolic transformation. Autumn leaves painted the neighborhood in fiery reds and golds, reflecting the inner landscape of my life, vibrant, renewed, and alive. I spent hours outdoors, planting bulbs for the next spring, trimming hedges, and tending to the vegetable garden. Each task was meditative, an affirmation of my ability to shape my environment. Nature, in its quiet cycles, mirrored the resilience I had cultivated within myself. As the holidays approached again, I reflected on the past year. There had been challenges, of course, Tyler's occasional frustrations, minor disagreements with neighbors, and lingering emotions regarding Jason and Danielle. But these were small in comparison to the expansive sense of autonomy and fulfillment I now enjoyed. I realized that happiness was not a destination, but a practice, sustained through intentional choices, clear boundaries, and meaningful engagement with both people and projects that nurtured my spirit. Tyler and I decorated the house together, focusing on joy rather than obligation. The air smelled of cinnamon, pine, and baked treats, a sensory reminder of the life we had built. I noticed how Tyler's demeanor had changed, more confident, more present, and deeply engaged in the world around him. Watching him grow under the shelter of a home defined by love and respect rather than control or fear, brought a profound sense of satisfaction. I also made a conscious effort to document my journey more formally. Journals, letters, and recorded reflections became a repository of wisdom I could share with future generations. I included lessons about resilience, autonomy, and the subtleties of human relationships, stories that conveyed both cautionary insights and empowering strategies. These documents were more than memoirs. They were educational tools, affirmations of dignity, and potential sources of inspiration for anyone navigating complex family dynamics. Through consistent reflection, community involvement, and personal projects, I cultivated a life that was rich, meaningful, and wholly mine. Jason's absence, rather than a wound, became a backdrop against which my growth and achievement stood in stark relief. The contrast between past vulnerability and present strength reinforced the value of patience, foresight, and careful cultivation of selfhood. I had learned to navigate the delicate balance between accountability and forgiveness, autonomy and connection. I started noticing subtle changes in the neighborhood dynamics as winter settled in. People seemed to watch the Mayfield house with a quiet curiosity, almost as if they were learning a new rhythm from the way Tyler and I moved through our days. The kids on the street, once timid about venturing past Jason's imposing figure and Danielle's constant chatter, now approached with shy waves and smiles. Parents would glance over as they passed, nodding politely, perhaps sensing that the air had shifted, that a story of resilience and dignity was quietly rewriting itself in the space between the two houses. I began hosting small gatherings for neighbors and friends who shared my values: honesty, kindness, independence. These were not flashy events, no grand announcements or public showings, just simple moments of community, a shared meal, a game of cards, laughter that filled the kitchen, the warm scent of baked bread weaving through the rooms. Tyler loved these gatherings. He observed how people responded to sincere attention, to thoughtful gestures, and he mirrored that generosity naturally. It warmed my heart to see him learning the lessons of humanity I had strived to teach Jason, lessons that Danielle seemed incapable of understanding. Even in these small, everyday acts, I could feel a sense of equilibrium settling over my life. The winter evenings were long and still, perfect for reflection. I often sat in my favorite armchair with a steaming cup of tea, letting the quietness seep into me, affirming the choices I had made. My journal lay open on the side table, filled with observations, sketches, and plans. Some entries were mundane, a note about the weather, a grocery list, but many were strategic reflections, thoughts on relationships, finances, and personal growth. These written words became a blueprint for the life I was intentionally crafting, a tangible record of my autonomy and power. Jason, meanwhile, seemed to shrink into the background of the neighborhood. I noticed his presence mostly through shadows in the windows, the faint sound of his TV late at night, the occasional hum of his car engine as he left for errands. I never interfered. I did not call. I did not confront. My silence was my strength, a living reminder of how ineffective control can be when wielded without empathy or respect. Danielle, on the other hand, seemed increasingly anxious. The garden parties became sporadic. The music, once a piercing soundtrack to her attempts at dominance, was now muted. It was as if they were learning in their own slow way that life cannot be forced to conform to entitlement or aggression. I also focused on strengthening my financial literacy and planning for the future. I consulted Monica regularly, not because I felt insecure about my resources, but because I wanted to ensure that Tyler's future was protected and that the house, the legacy, and the money I had worked so hard for would serve their intended purpose. Every meeting was a reaffirmation of the law's power when used with clarity, preparation, and ethical intent. I realized that knowledge, combined with persistence, could be more effective than confrontation or anger. It could, in fact, outlast both. Tyler began asking more questions about family history, particularly about his father, grandparents, and his great-grandfather. He seemed to understand intuitively that these stories were part of a larger mosaic that shaped his identity. I told him stories not as complaints or confessions, but as lessons, illustrating the consequences of choices, the value of honesty, and the importance of maintaining personal integrity. He absorbed these stories eagerly, reflecting on the difference between building a life of respect and a life built on manipulation. One afternoon, while trimming the rose bushes, I noticed a small note tucked under a stone near the fence. It was a simple, hastily written apology from Danielle, admitting some regret about how things had been handled. I did not respond. The gesture was enough for me. It demonstrated that actions leave echoes even when voices remain silent. I wanted nothing from her, no validation, no confrontation, no reconciliation. I was content to let her acknowledgement remain a private artifact of reflection as I moved forward with my own life. The physical environment of my new home became a sanctuary for personal growth. I painted one wall in a warm amber hue that caught the light just right in the afternoon, creating a subtle glow across the living space. Shelves were arranged to highlight photographs, books, and plants, each item a deliberate choice that reflected my values and aspirations. This space, crafted carefully over weeks and months, became a mirror for the interior landscape I was cultivating. Calm, intentional, resilient, and alive with possibility. Tyler and I also started a small vegetable garden in the backyard, cultivating tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. It was more than a practical project. It was an exercise in patience, nurturing, and observation. We learned together when to water, when to prune, when to step back and let growth happen at its own pace. These lessons paralleled life in many ways. You can provide the right conditions, but you cannot force results. Success, whether in plants, people, or personal ambitions, is a process, not an imposition. I observed the changing seasons as both a literal and symbolic marker of growth. Winter melted into spring. The roses I had planted along the fence burst forth in vibrant reds and pinks, a visual representation of the quiet triumphs I had achieved. Tyler noticed the blooms first, eyes wide with delight. "Grandma," he said, "they're beautiful. It's like they've been waiting for us." I nodded, recognizing the truth in his words. The roses, resilient and persistent, mirrored the life we were building, one rooted in care, effort, and intention. Community life continued to weave itself around our home. Neighbors began seeking advice, sharing stories, and forming genuine connections. There was a subtle ripple effect, where once isolation or fear had prevailed, a sense of interdependence and mutual respect was emerging. People approached Tyler and me not out of obligation, but out of curiosity, admiration, and trust. I realized that my presence, guided by integrity and patience, had become a stabilizing force in a small but meaningful corner of the neighborhood. I maintained careful awareness of boundaries. Jason's occasional attempts to interact were met with quiet acknowledgement, but firm limits. I did not allow his presence, words, or intentions to dictate my emotional state. Peace, I had learned, is not the absence of difficulty, but the ability to navigate it with clarity and confidence. This approach extended beyond family interactions. It became a general philosophy for all relationships, both old and new. Tyler's growth was astonishing. He developed confidence, independence, and curiosity. He explored hobbies in music, art, and literature, and he began mentoring younger children in the neighborhood. Observing his development was profoundly satisfying, a reminder that legacy is built not through possession or control, but through the nurturing of others in ways that encourage autonomy, resilience, and ethical growth. The house, now more than a residence, became a symbol of intentional living. Every corner, from the kitchen to the garden, reflected choices rooted in care, creativity, and empowerment. Tyler and I thrived within this environment. We worked together, laughed together, and learned together. Each day reinforced the truth that a life reclaimed, intentionally and deliberately, could yield profound satisfaction beyond what any legal or financial victory could provide. As spring progressed, the neighborhood began to notice the transformation. Where Jason and Danielle had attempted to dominate through noise, presence, or spectacle, a quieter, more intentional influence had taken root. Tyler and I became a source of quiet inspiration, demonstrating the efficacy of patience, boundaries, and purposeful living. The lesson was subtle but undeniable. Control is fleeting, integrity and persistence endure. I continued documenting my journey, blending reflection, planning, and creative expression. The journals and sketches became a roadmap for both present and future, a way to preserve lessons learned, mistakes avoided, and victories achieved. This body of work, while private, also had the potential to serve others, reinforcing the idea that individual resilience can ripple outward, influencing lives beyond immediate circles. I woke that morning to a sky brushed in soft pinks and golds, a sunrise that seemed unusually deliberate, as if it were taking its own time to witness the day ahead. Tyler was already in the kitchen, carefully measuring flour for pancakes, humming a tune I didn't recognize but liked immediately. The quiet domesticity of the scene contrasted sharply with the chaos of the previous months, a contrast that made me smile. Life, I realized, had a way of rewarding patience with moments that felt almost sacred in their simplicity. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the aroma rich and grounding, and settled at the table with my notebook open. I noted the tasks for the day, tending to the garden, planning a small community project, and checking in on a few elderly neighbors who had become friends over the past weeks. Each task was meaningful, small in scale yet vast in significance. They were reminders that reclaiming your life doesn't always require dramatic gestures. Often it's in the accumulation of thoughtful, deliberate acts that transformation truly happens. As we ate breakfast, Tyler asked questions about the roses along the fence. "Grandma," he said, pointing to the fiery blooms, "why did you plant these here, right across from Jason's house?" I paused, savoring my bite of pancake before responding. "Because, baby, sometimes people need to see that life continues, that beauty and care can exist even when someone tries to erase it. These roses are reminders, not punishments. They're proof of resilience." Tyler nodded slowly, letting the meaning sink in. He had begun to understand the subtleties of life that are often invisible to those too caught up in their own narratives. After breakfast, we stepped outside to the garden. The morning air was crisp but gentle, carrying the scent of wet earth and the faint, lingering aroma of jasmine from the tea I'd brewed the night before. Tyler and I worked in tandem, planting new marigolds and repositioning the tomato cages. I watched him carefully, noting the way he approached each task with concentration, a sense of responsibility, and the joy of creation. It struck me that these small acts, tending plants, cultivating life, were teaching him lessons that no lecture or reprimand ever could. Later, I visited Mrs. Carter, a widow who lived 2 streets over. She greeted me at the door with a faint smile, her hands trembling slightly as she held a cup of tea. "Dolores," she said, "I didn't expect you today." I smiled warmly. "I wanted to check in. How have you been feeling?" We spent the next hour together, talking about her garden, sharing memories, and organizing her paperwork so she could keep her independence intact. It was a simple gesture, but one that reaffirmed my belief in the power of presence. Influence, I had learned, is often quiet and cumulative rather than flashy or forceful. Returning home, I noticed the mailbox at Jason and Danielle's house. It was stuffed with advertisements, unpaid bills, and what looked like a notice from the HOA. The sight made me pause, a subtle reminder of the chaos left in the wake of their choices. I didn't feel glee or satisfaction, those emotions were fleeting, but a steady, quiet sense of justice, born not from vindictiveness, but from alignment. Life had a way of balancing itself when you honored your own path and maintained integrity in the face of betrayal. Tyler and I spent the afternoon in the living room, sorting through old photographs and letters. He had become fascinated with genealogy, asking questions about great-grandparents, old family homes, and the legacy of both triumphs and mistakes. We laughed, reminisced, and occasionally fell silent, letting the weight of history settle between us. These moments of shared reflection deepened our bond and allowed Tyler to see that family, while flawed, could also be a source of profound connection and learning when approached with care and honesty. The evening brought a visit from Monica, who had become not just a legal advisor, but a trusted friend and mentor. We discussed updates on Tyler's trust, the progress of our community initiatives, and the small victories in maintaining boundaries with Jason and Danielle. Monica's presence was grounding. Her counsel reminded me that planning for the future is not only about legal safeguards but also about strategic thinking, awareness, and emotional resilience. Each decision we made was deliberate, each action a step toward a life defined by choice rather than circumstance. As night fell, the quiet of the neighborhood enveloped us. I sat on the porch with Tyler, sipping jasmine tea, watching the stars emerge one by one. We spoke softly about school, dreams, and the small wonders of the world. Tyler asked, "Grandma, do you ever miss how things were before?" I considered the question carefully. Sometimes, I admitted, but missing the past doesn't mean I want to go back. It means I appreciate what it taught me and use that wisdom to make today better. He nodded, a thoughtful expression settling across his face, and I saw in him the seeds of understanding, maturity, and empathy. The days continued in a rhythm of purpose and quiet accomplishment. Each morning brought small victories, a new bloom in the garden, a conversation with a neighbor, a moment of shared laughter. Each afternoon held opportunities for reflection, creativity, and connection. Each evening was a reminder that peace is cultivated through consistent care, intentionality, and the courage to define one's own boundaries. Jason's occasional attempts at intrusion were met with calm, deliberate acknowledgement, but never engagement. My silence, far from passive, became a form of power, an assertion that life reclaimed cannot be taken away through coercion or fear. In the weeks that followed, I began hosting informal workshops on financial literacy and personal empowerment for the local senior community. The sessions were small but impactful, focused on helping women navigate elder law, protect assets, and assert independence in the face of familial pressure. The participants, mostly women in their 60s and 70s, responded with gratitude and energy. Some shared stories eerily similar to mine: children who dismissed them, families who assumed incompetence, and the quiet despair of losing control over one's own life. In guiding them, I recognized the broader purpose of my journey: to transform personal struggle into communal empowerment. Tyler thrived alongside me, actively participating in these workshops when appropriate, demonstrating empathy, curiosity, and the practical skills he was learning at home. I noticed that his confidence had grown exponentially. He spoke with clarity, asked thoughtful questions, and offered insights that surprised even me. Watching him develop into a young man capable of ethical reasoning and emotional intelligence was a profound reward. It reminded me that while revenge had been a part of my story, it was the reclamation of dignity, love, and mentorship that defined its lasting impact. The neighborhood began to shift around us. People noticed not just the roses, the care, or the garden, but the consistency, the visible calm, the energy of a life lived intentionally. Jason and Danielle's house became increasingly quiet, their attempts at dominance fading under the weight of their own choices. Observing from a distance, I realized that influence and change often arrive not through confrontation, but through steadfastness, patience, and integrity. My life, once dominated by others' assumptions and control, had become a living example of that principle. In the quiet evenings, Tyler and I continued our routines, tending the garden, preparing meals, reflecting on stories, and planning for the future. Each day reinforced the notion that freedom is not merely physical, but deeply psychological. Autonomy over your life, your choices, and your environment is a profound form of power, one that cannot be revoked by others' opinions, legal maneuvers, or attempts at control. It is cultivated through awareness, patience, and deliberate action. Our bond deepened as the seasons shifted towards summer. Tyler began exploring more ambitious projects in art and science, inspired by the nurturing environment we had built together. We took trips to the local library, museums, and parks, enriching his education beyond the confines of traditional schooling. Each excursion was not just a learning experience, but a reinforcement of the lessons I had lived. Curiosity, resilience, and ethical action are cornerstones of a meaningful life. At home, I continued to document my thoughts and plans, mixing practical notes with reflective entries and creative sketches. The journals had become a tool not only for memory, but for strategic thinking and emotional processing. They provided clarity, served as an archive of accomplishments, and ensured that Tyler and I had a record of our progress should challenges arise again. In these written reflections, I found a rhythm that mirrored life itself, a balance of action, observation, and contemplation. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the windows in sharp, golden lines that cut across the living room floor. Tyler was already at the table, headphones in, sketching diagrams and notes for a school project on renewable energy. Watching him, I felt a surge of pride, not just for his intelligence or curiosity, but for the steadiness of character he displayed even in mundane moments. It was in these quiet, ordinary observations that the reality of change crystallized. Life, when nurtured with care and attention, unfolds in ways that surprise and sustain. I sipped my coffee and reflected on how far we had come. The house, once shadowed by tension and unspoken grievances, now radiated a sense of calm and purpose. Our routines had become anchors, and within their steady rhythm, I discovered a deep reservoir of contentment. It wasn't about erasing the past, but rather about creating an environment where Tyler and I could thrive, untouched by the lingering chaos that Jason and Danielle represented. Later, I organized a small outing with a few neighbors and their grandchildren. We visited the community botanical gardens, a space that seemed almost enchanted in the soft afternoon light. Tyler ran ahead, his laughter ringing through the flower-lined paths, while I followed at a slower pace, absorbing the beauty around me. I couldn't help but notice the contrasts, the neglect in some corners, the care in others, and it struck me as a metaphor for life itself. Choice determines the quality of experience, and the outcomes we witness are the direct reflection of the attention and effort we invest. During the walk, we stumbled upon a section of the garden dedicated to resilience plants, species known to thrive in the harshest conditions. I stopped to examine a gnarled, twisted tree, its roots exposed and battered yet still vibrant. "Look at this, Tyler," I said. "Even when life tries to break us, it's possible to bend without breaking. Strength isn't always about standing straight. Sometimes it's about enduring with grace." He tilted his head, considering the metaphor, and I felt a profound sense that the lessons I had learned were taking root in him, shaping his understanding of both struggle and opportunity. Returning home, the afternoon sun had softened, casting long shadows across the garden. Tyler began a small experiment with composting, inspired by our earlier discussions on sustainability. I watched him methodically layer organic material, noting the balance of carbon and nitrogen, and realized how far he had come in grasping both scientific principles and the philosophical implications of nurturing life. It was an exercise in responsibility, patience, and observation, all the qualities that had become central to our shared life. Dinner was a quiet affair, with Tyler and I preparing a simple pasta dish together. The conversation flowed naturally, shifting from school projects to dreams of travel and ideas for our garden. In these exchanges, I noticed the subtle ways in which his perspective had matured. He asked questions not just about what was happening, but about why, about consequences, and about ethics. It was a dialogue that reflected curiosity and critical thinking, qualities I had always hoped to cultivate in him. After dinner, I spent a few moments on the porch, letting the cool evening air settle around me. The sky deepened into a rich navy, dotted with stars, and I allowed myself to reflect on the past year. The journey had been tumultuous, legal battles, betrayals, and the painstaking navigation of family dynamics. Yet, in retrospect, each obstacle had served a purpose, shaping a life that was stronger, more self-aware, and filled with meaningful connections. I understood now that true success isn't measured by wealth or recognition, but by the depth of relationships, the integrity of choices, and the resilience cultivated through adversity. Tyler joined me shortly, carrying a sketchbook filled with diagrams of solar panels and water filtration systems. We sat together in silence, watching fireflies emerge among the garden beds. "Grandma," he said finally, Do you think people like Jason and Danielle ever realize what they've lost? I pondered this quietly. Maybe, I replied, but it doesn't matter. Realization isn't for them, it's for us. Our growth and peace aren't dependent on their understanding. What matters is that we've learned, survived, and created something meaningful. He nodded, absorbing the words with the kind of quiet reflection that often precedes deeper understanding. As night settled fully, I reviewed the plans for the next day, a visit to a local senior center, finalizing a community garden project, and preparing materials for a workshop on emotional resilience. Each task reinforced the rhythm of a life lived intentionally. I recognized that every choice, no matter how small, carried the potential to shape outcomes, not just for Tyler and me, but for everyone we interacted with. The power of intentionality had become a guiding principle, transforming ordinary routines into acts of significance. The following week brought a minor challenge when a letter arrived from Jason's attorney, questioning the terms of Tyler's trust. Rather than reacting with panic or anger, I carefully reviewed the details with Monica. Our approach was methodical and calm: documentation, clarity, and strategic planning. By evening, the issue was resolved with minimal confrontation, demonstrating the value of preparation and composed response. Tyler observed the process, learning firsthand that conflict doesn't always require dramatic gestures, but rather steady, informed action. On one particularly bright morning, Tyler and I decided to document our garden projects and experiments in a digital journal. We took photographs, noted growth patterns, and even recorded short videos demonstrating composting techniques and planting methods. It was a project that combined creativity, science, and memory, reinforcing skills in observation, reflection, and communication. We planned to share the results with our neighbors and at the local library, hoping to inspire others in our community to take small, impactful steps towards sustainability and empowerment. One afternoon, while rearranging the flower beds, I overheard Tyler talking to a friend on the phone. "Yeah, Grandma taught me how resilience works," he said. "It's not just about surviving, it's about planning, reflecting, and making things better than they were before." I smiled quietly, realizing that the lessons I had worked so hard to embody were being transmitted organically. The impact of one's actions, I thought, is often invisible until the right moment reveals it, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Evenings became moments for reflection, reading, and planning. Tyler and I explored books on psychology, ethics, and environmental science, interweaving discussions of theory with practical applications in our lives. We analyzed scenarios, debated outcomes, and brainstormed solutions to hypothetical challenges. These exercises, while intellectually stimulating, also reinforced emotional intelligence and ethical reasoning. It became clear to me that nurturing Tyler's mind and character required balance: guidance without control, challenge without pressure, and freedom paired with responsibility. As summer approached, our community initiatives expanded. We organized small workshops on composting, gardening, and sustainable living. Elderly participants found joy in practical demonstrations, while children gained hands-on experience in observation, experimentation, and teamwork. The energy was contagious, a blend of curiosity, cooperation, and the satisfaction of creating tangible results. Each interaction reinforced the principle that empowerment is contagious. When one person learns and grows, the effects ripple outward, touching others in unexpected ways. On particularly quiet evenings, I reflected on the emotional landscape that had defined the past year. The feelings of betrayal and exclusion, once overwhelming, had been replaced by a calm confidence in the integrity of our choices. I understood now that power is not demonstrated through dominance or revenge, but through consistency, clarity, and the cultivation of life that is meaningful. Tyler had absorbed these lessons, his character strengthened not through fear or control, but through observation, example, and guided experience. One night, as we sat on the porch under a sky dotted with stars, Tyler asked, "Grandma, do you ever feel lonely?" I considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but loneliness is different from emptiness. Loneliness can be a reminder to reach out, to connect, and to invest in meaningful relationships. emptiness is what you feel when you lack purpose or direction. We've filled our lives with purpose, so even in quiet moments, there's richness and presence. He nodded, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind, the subtle understanding that fulfillment is cultivated through deliberate, intentional living.